Good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Liz Krueger, the state senator from District 28, here mostly on the east side of Manhattan, although I wriggle around Midtown in certain areas and also Chelsea, parts of Chelsea and the Flatiron and Gramercy Park. But everyone is welcome to our town halls wherever you are living and you're checking in with us. So, I want to remind everyone that this is live on Zoom and Facebook, and some people are actually calling into the town hall discussion this evening. Before I get to the proceedings, and it's all about the 5 ballot questions that you will be asked when you go to vote on election day, vote for or against on election day. Before I get to the proceedings, I want you to be aware we have closed captioning available. As a viewer, you have to activate your closed captioning to view the text on your device. If you're in Zoom, click on the live transcript in the meeting controls to start viewing closed captioning. If you're on Facebook Live events, you will see a setting button in the bottom right-hand corner of your video. Click closed caption CC to start viewing closed captioning. This has really been a terrific advance for anyone who may have the smallest hearing problems to full-fledged deafness. It allows them to participate in more and more options on the computer. I think that's fantastic. All right, a few announcements. Since we're talking about election votes, the deadline to register to vote and participate in the November general election is tomorrow. Tomorrow, folks, Friday, October 8th. So you still have time to register, and you can go to democracynyc.turbovote.org, and you can online register to vote. Early voting will run from October 23rd to the 31st, and election day is November 2nd. I'm sure that someone will be putting that democracynyc.turbovote.org up in the chat for you. All right, I can't do anything without reporting in on the newest information about COVID, because that's the world we live in. The number of people getting tested for COVID-19 has increased since the start of the school year, and with more community face-to-face interaction. There are some questions about where to go for testing and how to avoid long waiting lines. You can search for testing sites by location and minimum age using the online COVID-19 test site finder. The link is posted in the chat. New York City's Health and Hospitals has testing sites that serve people of all ages, age 2 and above, and age 4 and above, which varies by testing site. The link to the list for the New York City Health and Hospitals testing sites is also posted in the chat. Then we have New York City Health and Hospitals testing sites continue to have shorter waiting times to get tested. You might want to know that. And you can also try different testing site locations where the waiting periods vary by location. For those of you who can't leave your homes, at-home testing is available to people who are immunocompromised and who are 65 or older. Call the phone number 929-298-9400 to schedule an appointment. And these are all going into the chat. And then we're going to move to tonight's event. Know before you vote. The 5 New York State constitutional amendments that will be on your ballot in November. The information the presenters will share this evening is intended for educational purposes only and is not an endorsement of any particular position, pro or con, on the amendments. You should know that this event is being recorded. Everyone who RSVP'd for tonight's event will receive an email of a link to the video a couple of days after the event. And again, I really want to emphasize, this is your opportunity to impact New York State's Constitution. In order for any of these questions to arrive on your ballot, they had to move through both houses of the legislature, the Senate and the Assembly, twice in 2 different legislative sessions. So there was a lot of work put into actually moving these ballot questions to your attention as a voter, because now it's all up to us as voters, not whether I'm in the legislature or someone else is in the legislature. Now it's up to us to decide by the way we vote whether we will be changing New York State's constitution in 5 very distinct ways. And people worry, and I worry, that even though we know it's the election, it's a big election for New York City, and many people are going to be going either on election day or in the 10 days of early voting or voting by mail, that a certain percentage of those people won't even realize they're supposed to turn the ballot over to see that there are 5 additional questions once they get past the people they're voting for. Or they will take a look and they'll say, there's too much information here for me to deal with right now. I'm just going to ignore them all. So really our hope for you all tonight is you learn some more about these 5 questions, and you have a chance between now and when you do vote to do some more research if you like, and we'll be providing additional references for you to go to on the chat. Do some more research for yourself, talk about it with your friends and family, and think about the impact on the state of New York if these changes are made to our Constitution. With that, I just want to highlight that in addition to voting on the important offices, we have, oh, I'm sorry, I really already went over that, excuse me. Tonight, we will hear from some expert presenters from the Brennan Center for Justice and Environmental Advocates of New York to learn about the amendments so that you can make an informed choice in November when you vote. The proposals, I'll just list them off once now. Same-day voter registration, no excuse absentee voting, amending the apportionment and redistricting process, the right to clean air and water, and expanding New York City's civil court jurisdiction. First, we will hear from Patrick Berry, who is the counsel to the Brennan Center for Justice's Democracy Project. Patrick will provide information about the Brennan Center and the important work they do, give you an overview of New York State's process to amend the Constitution, and then he will discuss the ballot initiatives regarding no excuse voting and same-day voter registration initiatives. After Patrick, we're going to hear from Yurij Rudensky, also counsel to the Democracy Project, who will take us through the sometimes very complicated redistricting initiative. Following Yurij will be Kate Kurera, Deputy Director of Environmental Advocates New York, who will provide information on the Right to Clean Air and Water initiative. And finally, we will swing back to Patrick Berry, who will provide us information on the Civil Court Jurisdiction Initiative. After the presentations, I will moderate a Q&A portion of the event. Many people have submitted questions in advance, but if you're on either Zoom or Facebook Live, you still have an opportunity to type questions into the chat, and hopefully we will have time to take up additional questions at the end of this presentation. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Patrick Berry. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me, Senator Krueger, and hello everyone who's tuning in. Again, my name is Patrick Berry, and I'm an attorney in the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice, where I work on the Fair Courts team and the Voting Rights and Elections team. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Brennan Center, we're a nonpartisan law and policy institute affiliated with NYU Law that works to reform, revitalize, and defend our country's systems of democracy and justice. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about a few of the measures that'll be on the ballot in New York this November, namely those related to voting and New York City's civil court system. But before I begin, I'm going to quickly talk about the process for amending the New York State Constitution. Next slide, please. New York's Constitution can be amended in 2 ways. The first way is through a constitutional convention, which is a meeting of elected delegates who propose revisions and amendments to the state's constitution that then go before voters for approval. Under New York's Constitution, voters are asked every 20 years whether they would like to hold a constitutional convention. The legislature can also put a question on the ballot asking voters whether they would like to call one. The last constitutional convention in New York was held in 1967, and voters rejected conventions in 1977, 1997, and 2017. The next vote on a constitutional convention will be held in 2037. The second way New York's constitution can be amended, which Senator Krueger mentioned, is by voters approving a legislatively referred constitutional amendment, which is a proposed amendment that is put on the ballot by the state legislature. In New York, legislatively referred constitutional amendments must be approved by both houses of the legislature, then voted on again in both chambers after the Senate and Assembly have had one election cycle. All 5 measures on the ballot this November were put there by the New York legislature, and they were first voted on in 2019, then again in 2021. Between 1995 and 2020, New York's legislature put 25 proposed amendments on the ballot for approval, 19 of which were approved by voters. And in New York State, only the legislature can put a proposed constitutional amendment on the ballot. Citizens cannot. Next slide, please. The first measure related to voting, Proposal 3, would change the deadline for registering to vote in New York State. Currently, New York's constitution prohibits citizens from registering to vote less than 10 days before an election. However, the legislature passed a law in 1981, which is still in place, that requires voters to register at least 25 days before an election. If approved by voters, Proposal 3 would get rid of the 10-day voter registration requirement in New York State Constitution, allowing the legislature to write a new law explicitly allowing same-day registration, which they said they do if Proposal 3 is approved. 20 states and DC currently have some form of same-day registration, which allows eligible voters to register and vote on the same day, either during early voting, on election day, or both. Supporters of same-day registration say it increases voter turnout. In support, they point to studies that show that turnout in states with same-day registration is higher than turnout in states without it. Supporters also say that same-day registration allows more people to participate, as it gives would-be voters up until the very last moment to participate in an election. There are plenty of reasons why someone might miss the voter registration deadline, especially when it's 25 days before the election, like in New York. For example, they didn't know when the deadline was. They're usually not politically engaged until closer to the election, or they're a new voter who turned 18 or became naturalized after the deadline. Same-day registration would allow those voters to participate. Supporters also say that same-day registration allows for more accurate and up-to-date voter rolls. If a voter shows up on election day and is told they're not on the voter rolls because of an administrative error, like what happened in Brooklyn in 2016, when thousands of eligible voters showed up to cast their ballots in the presidential primary, only to find their names missing from the rolls, those voters wouldn't be allowed to re-register and vote unless New York had same-day registration. Opponents of same-day registration say it'll give election officials less time to confirm a voter's eligibility. The reality is that hasn't proven to be an issue in all the jurisdictions that currently have same-day voter registration, some of which have had it for decades, because there are ways to implement such a system to ensure that election officials can easily verify a voter's eligibility. Opponents of same-day registration also say that it'll create an administrative burden for election officials because it requires more resources, such as additional staffing at voting sites during the election to process same-day registrations. However, in recent years, New York has made it easier to register to vote. We now have online registration and automatic voter registration. And because of these reforms, the number of people who would show up to the polls unregistered will be very small. So same-day registration shouldn't impose a major burden on election officials. Next slide, please. The next measure related to voting, Proposal 4, would expand access to absentee voting in New York State. New York's Constitution currently requires voters to be absent from their home county, ill, or physically disabled in order to vote using an absentee ballot. New York has had no excuse absentee voting since the start of the pandemic as a result of an executive order signed by then Governor Cuomo and a temporary law that was passed by the state legislature. If approved by voters, Proposal 4 would enable the legislature to pass a law making no excuse absentee voting permanent in New York. 34 states and DC currently do not require an excuse from those wishing to vote absentee or by mail, and 6 of those states conduct their elections entirely by mail, meaning that voters don't have to request an absentee ballot, they automatically receive one. Supporters of no excuse absentee voting say that it'll make voting more accessible by allowing more people to vote in a manner that's more convenient for them. Voters may also have several reasons for not being able to vote in person, such as an unpredictable work schedule, caregiving duties, or a desire to avoid large crowds, none of which currently count as a valid excuse for voting absentee under New York's Constitution. Supporters also say that no excuse absentee voting will reduce the number of voters who show up to the polls, leading to shorter lines and less work for election officials during early voting and on election day. Supporters also say that no excuse absentee voting ensures access to the ballot when something unexpected, like a natural disaster or a pandemic, makes in-person voting difficult or impossible. In support, they point to the last 18 months in which almost all 16 states that currently require an excuse to vote absentee, including New York, expanded no excuse absentee voting for the 2020 election due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Supporters also note that no excuse absentee voting is very popular with voters. More than 1.9 million voters, or about 14% of those who are registered to vote in New York, voted absentee for the presidential election. And many of those voters voted absentee for the first time in their lives, myself included. Opponents of no excuse absentee voting say it's harder to verify someone's identity when they vote by mail than when they vote in person. However, the process for verifying a voter's identity in New York State, whether they vote in person or by mail, is the same. Opponents also claim that no excuse absentee voting drags out reporting of election results. While this was true for the 2020 election and some elections this year, it's okay to not have the election results the night polls close, especially when that means that there's equal access to the ballot for all eligible voters. Also, how long it takes to count absentee ballots depends on the state. In many jurisdictions, election officials are allowed to begin counting absentee ballots before polls close. And while it was really bad in New York, the legislature recently made some changes that will allow absentee ballots to be processed sooner. Opponents also say that no excuse absentee voting involves more variables that can result in a voter's ballot being lost, damaged, or disqualified. The instructions for absentee voting can also be confusing, and delays with the Postal Service may make it difficult to return your ballot by mail. But again, a lot of jurisdictions currently have no excuse absentee voting, some of which allow voters to return their ballots using secure drop boxes or by dropping it off at their polling site. Several states also conduct their elections entirely by mail, so it's possible to have no excuse absentee voting that doesn't result in ballots getting lost, damaged, or disqualified. We simply just can't use having poor election administration as an excuse for not having pro-voter policies, and we should instead improve our election administrative policies. That's all for me from now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And next we're going to hear from Yurij Rudensky. Hi, Yurij.
Hello, Senator Krueger. Thanks for having me. Thank you to you and your staff for putting together this town hall. I am going to share my screen. I hope my slide deck is now up. So I am a counsel in the Brennan Center's democracy program. I work exclusively on redistricting, and one of the things that I've been working on for a number of years, coming up on 4 years now, is state level redistricting reform. And while the Brennan Center has not worked on New York ballot proposal 1, which pertains to redistricting, this is the sort of thing that I spend my days doing. So I'm happy to walk through the current process and how ballot proposal 1 will change it. In 2014, New York voters approved an amendment to the Constitution that established a 10-member advisory commission for drawing districts of both legislative chambers and for congressional districts as well. What we mean when we say advisory commission is that these individuals don't have the authority to enact a final plan. Instead, what they do is they travel around the state, holding hearings in different boroughs around the city and in different regions of the rest of the state, and they solicit public input, and they pull it together in draft proposals that they vote on and then submit to the legislature. The way that this commission is convened is that the majority and minority leaders in both chambers of the legislature each appoint 2 commissioners. That means there are 4 Democratic appointees and 4 Republican appointees. These initial 8 commissioners have to get together and appoint the final 2 commissioners who are individuals that are not affiliated with either party. The advisory commission, the rules for doing their work and passing maps depends on which party controls the legislature or if the legislature is under split control. For the commission to pass a map in a single party control environment, which is what we are in now, one commissioner appointed by each legislative leader, so that is one appointed by the speaker, one appointed by the leader of the Senate, one appointed by the minority leader, one appointed by the minority leader in the Senate, have to vote to pass the plan and to pass it along to the legislature for consideration. And total, there has to be 7 commissioners. So a supermajority, 7 out of 10 have to vote to approve, with 4 commissioners, 1 that has been appointed by each legislative leader. In a split control environment, those rules are slightly different. Currently, if no plan gets 7 votes, or if there isn't the right distribution of commissioners, that is, there isn't one commissioner that has been appointed by each legislative leader voting to advance a particular plan, then what gets submitted to the legislature is the plan that received the most votes. The state legislature takes this work and votes on the plan without amendment. Here too, it depends in terms of how the legislature can pass a map, depends on the partisan distribution and how the different members of the commission voted. And it could, if there is sufficient bipartisanship and passage, a simple majority suffices. If there isn't, then and there's split control, a simple majority is sufficient. If there's split control and there isn't sufficient bipartisanship and you don't have the right distribution, then it's 60% of each chamber that has to vote to approve it. And if the state is under single party control, which is the case currently, then 2/3 of each chamber have to vote to approve the plan. If that threshold isn't reached, or if the plan is vetoed and the governor does retain the veto over redistricting, then the commission has to try again and submits a second plan. If that vote fails in the legislature, or if there's a veto, then the legislature takes over the redistricting process and uses the regular legislative process to pass plans for both the state legislature and for Congress. Under ballot proposal 1, that will change. And specifically, the things that will change are the rules for approving maps, some deadlines change, and certain redistricting criteria. The impact would apply both to congressional and state legislative maps. So I will talk about changes to apportionment. And apportionment is the process of sizing districts and determining how many districts there will be in the legislature. One of the things that ballot proposal 1 does is it fixes the number of state Senate seats and state senators at 63 members. The other thing that it does is it removes old language that would exclude immigrants and Native individuals from counting for purposes of redistricting, language that the US Supreme Court has long held is unconstitutional. And so that language would be removed, and total population, counting all the inhabitants of New York State, would become the new constitutional standard. The other thing it would do is it would end prison gerrymandering. That is, individuals who are incarcerated wouldn't be counted at the site of the prison facility, but would instead be counted at their home address, their community address, the place that they are from and the place that they will likely return after incarceration. Prison gerrymandering has already been ended in New York by statute, but this would make it the rule in the Constitution. In map drawing, as I mentioned, there would be some changes to the timeline. There would be changes to voting procedures and removing the need to have different configurations of commissioners depending on who controls the legislature. And there would be some changes of rules in terms of appointing the co-executive directors of the commission. Again, simplifying the rules and allowing a majority of the commissioners to establish who will lead the work. There is also one change to the redistricting criteria, which is eliminating the block on border rule. The block on border rule prevents the redistricting commission from splitting up towns, but no similar rule applies to cities. So it's a criteria that applies to drawing the state Senate map that prevents splitting towns, but does not apply to splitting counties. That rule is removed. So for a little bit more specific run through these changes, I've created a chart that puts side by side the current law on the left and the proposed amendment on the right. So in terms of deadlines, as you will see, currently the deadline to get the first plan to the legislature is January 15th, 2022. That moves it up under the ballot proposal. That would move up a couple of weeks. For this cycle, the second plan is end of February. That would move it up significantly here to January 15th. In future cycles, that is in 2031, 2032, the first plan would be submitted by the beginning of November and the second plan by the beginning of January. Under current law, the legislature gains control of map drawing if they reject both commission plans. Under the proposed amendment, the legislature gains control if they reject both commission plans or if the commission fails to vote on plans by the first deadline. The apportionment changes. Current law allows the legislature to change how many state Senate seats there are. The proposed amendment freezes the number of state Senate seats and establishes 63, which is the current number, moving forward. There is also the dormant language that I mentioned that excludes non-citizens and Native Americans, and the proposed amendment would remove that language and establish all inhabitants of New York as the relevant basis. And there is a statute that applies to prison gerrymandering, and as I mentioned, that would be constitutionalized. In terms of the procedure, the rules for approving maps vary depending on whether the legislature is under single party or split control. And the proposed amendment changes that to make it a 7 commissioner majority that would advance maps. And in terms of co-executive directors, again, there is two sets of rules, and this would once again make it a simple majority. So 6 commissioners could vote to establish who the co-executive directors are. And finally, as I mentioned before, there is one criteria change. This block on border rule would be removed. That is ballot proposal 1, and I will be happy to answer any questions that folks may have.
Thank you very much, Yurij. To say the least, this is not such a simple question for people to think about if they haven't been involved with redistricting. But now we're going to jump to something that perhaps is the most critical issue of our times, the right to clean air and water. Kate Kurera is the Deputy Director of the Right to Clean Air and Water, I guess, project at Environmental Advocates. So thank you so much for being with us, Kate.
Hi, thank you, Senators, for having me. So let me just share my screen and I'll get started. Thanks. So as Senator Krueger mentioned, my name is Kate Kurera. I'm the Deputy Director at an organization called Environmental Advocates NY. We're based in Albany, and we're a nonprofit environmental organization fighting for policies that protect New York's air, water, and communities. We do this through education, advocacy, and partnerships. And what I'm going to talk to you about this evening is Proposal 2, a right to clean air, clean water, and a healthful environment that will appear on the New York State ballot in November. Again, this is the second question on the ballot, and it's a pretty straightforward question. It will read as, the proposed amendment to Article 1 of the New York State Constitution would establish the right for each person to clean air, clean water, and a healthful environment. Shall this proposed amendment be approved? So it's very simple in what it's asking voters to do. It is Article 1, so that's the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution, which is an important point to make as well. So what exactly does this mean? So it means a couple of different things. One of the first things that is important to understand about it is that giving this right elevating this right into the Constitution provides these rights the same fundamental protections that have currently provided to a lot of other rights that we hold so dear to us as New York residents, and civil liberties such as our freedom to speech, religion, your ability to get divorced in New York State, and even your fundamental constitutional right to play bingo in New York. So it does elevate and give it the same level of protection. What it also means, because this is how all of our other constitutional rights are applied through decision making, it will require greater consideration of the environment, of our water, air, and our environment in government decision making. So the idea is that when you elevate this right into the Constitution, legislators, council members, every level of government will have to take this into account before making decisions, and avoiding environmental harm will be paramount to that. The third thing it does is it actually provides a tool. It's preventative, and I guess I often talk about it as a shield and a sword. So in other ways, it can be used as a tool by community and others to protect against infringements to these rights, just the way other constitutional rights, if your right to free speech has been infringed upon by government action, or your freedom, your right to assembly, all of those things, you have access to fight or challenge that infringement. A couple oppositional arguments. I guess there hasn't been very organized opposition that we've seen come out on this, at least during this campaign stage, when the legislature voted on it for 2 consecutive sessions. As the senator mentioned, there were some opposition, but it hasn't been very organized, as we've seen. But some arguments we have heard is that an amendment like this may open up floodgates of litigation. There are 2 other states that have a very similar right, and that's Montana and Pennsylvania. And the evidence of those kind of floodgate of litigation ensuing hasn't been shown. Others have often said that it might be duplicative or unnecessary. There is no such right in the Constitution, so it's not duplicative. I mean, there are lots of environmental laws that are on the books currently in New York State, and that is true. But they achieve different, they're designed for other purposes, and they achieve different things. They are there to regulate pollution. So we allow pollution to occur, and then we limit the amount of pollution through regulation and law. And then if too much pollution occurs, we then regulate it and use our laws to clean it up. So this is more of a preventative model of environmental decision-making, in using a precautionary principle approach, in that we consider the harm before we make the decisions. Other oppositional arguments we've heard is that the wording is very broad, it's aspirational, it's too general. That's quite common and characteristic of constitutional rights to be defined through the court system, through interpretation of the law and the Constitution through the courts and jurisprudence. So moving on, I just also thought it'd be worth mentioning, there have been some public polling done in relation to this amendment in particular. Siena College has a number of different polls. The first one, they polled just New Yorkers that are concerned about water pollution and air pollution, and 92% of New Yorkers are concerned. And then to go even more specific, a Siena poll that came out a couple months ago also found that 80% of likely 2021 voters would support this ballot measure. So I'm happy to answer questions again at the end as well. And if you're interested in more information, there is a website you could go to called RARWaterNY.org, where there's more additional information.
Thank you very much, Kate. Appreciate it. And now we are going to swing back to Patrick Berry, who's going to explain the last question on the ballot, expanding New York City's civil court jurisdiction. Back to you, Patrick.
Thanks so much, Senator. So again, the 5th and final measure that'll be on the ballot in New York this November is Proposal 5, which would allow New York City's civil court system, which has a small claims part, a housing part that hears landlord-tenant disputes, and a general civil part to hear cases involving greater amounts of money. Under New York's Constitution, the New York City Civil Court is currently limited to hearing cases involving claims worth $25,000 or less. Proposal 5, if approved by voters, would increase that limit to $50,000. Supporters say that increasing the monetary limit for New York City's civil court system is necessary to keep up with inflation. They note that the last time New York's Constitution was amended to raise the jurisdictional limit for New York City Civil Court was in 1983. And at that time, the limit was raised from 10,000 to 25,000, where it has since remained. Supporters also say that increasing the limit for New York City's civil court system will help relieve some of the burden on New York City's trial courts, which currently hear cases involving claims over $25,000. Opponents, meanwhile, say that more cases in the New York City civil court system will make an already busy court system more bogged down. They also point to the fact that New York City's civil court system isn't sufficiently funded and needs more staff. One other thing that I would note about Proposal 5 is that it would only impact New York City's 5 boroughs, but because it requires a constitutional amendment, it has to be approved by voters across the state. And thanks, I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Yeah, I knew that one wouldn't take too long. So now we are going to start the Q&A portion of this event. And I think the questions will be relatively obvious who they're for when I read them out. We also have more questions coming in through chat or through, more questions coming in through Q&A. And then I get to see them in chat. So you still have a chance to ask additional questions if you are online. Okay, let's start with the questions that came in. Ballot Proposal 2, which is clean air and water. Who determines what is clean air and water and a healthful environment, and how would this be enforced? Would power plants have to be shut down if they pollute, or people moved elsewhere, etc.? And then I'll just follow up. No, I'll ask that one first. And it's
Right.
Kate, obviously.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, that's a great question. So courts will interpret what it means, like all the other constitutional provisions. If someone brought a challenge claiming an infringement of their right to clean air, clean water, the courts would have to go through the process of interpreting that and what that means. So as I mentioned, there are many environmental laws and standards and regulations on the books. So courts would, of course, this is a new thing, but my anticipation is that courts would still be very deferential to the laws that exist, right? So power plants, just because they are permitted to emit pollution, doesn't necessarily by themselves make them violating the Constitution necessarily. So I would imagine that in courts interpreting this provision and understanding what clean and air and water means is that they would obviously use the current regulation and standards that are set by executive agencies, DEC, as well as science and other, professionals that have an opinion on that.
And are you aware of any specific legal actions that are likely to be taken up in the courts if we pass our clean air and water constitutional amendment? Are there people waiting with cases?
I don't know. I haven't heard of anyone waiting in the wings, waiting for this to happen. I think it will be very critical for advocates of this amendment to choose an important set of facts to litigate this, because it is an interesting question, and I don't think that this wouldn't be resolved. This will be resolved through the course of time. There are other states that have similar amendments, Pennsylvania most notably, and it hasn't been used a huge amount, but it has been used successfully there.
Got it. And actually, one of the questions that came in online, but it's, I think, relevant based on what you just said. So Pennsylvania does have a constitutional amendment. And how do they reconcile the fact that they have very permissive fracking in Pennsylvania with the fact that they actually have a constitutional amendment on clean air and clean water?
This is so the way that actually Pennsylvania's amendment was used successfully. So what happened in that, and it's a detailed situation, but I'll summarize it, where the state legislature passed a law that step back, a municipality passed a law to ban fracking in the municipality. A state legislature came in and kind of preempted that, saying municipalities can't ban fracking. We're a pro-fracking state, but that state law was struck down on the basis of the constitutional amendment. So yes, while Pennsylvania still does have fracking, it has been used in a way that has been protective of communities to stop fracking in certain instances.
So I don't think we have to worry about it right now, but in the previous president, we seem to have a federal government who was reversing themselves on many environmental policies and laws. Would our constitutional protection supersede if the federal government came in again and decided they wanted to drill in the middle of the Adirondacks or something else a little crazy like that?
We're probably getting into a very complicated constitutional, I am a lawyer, I'm not practicing at the moment, argument about whether or not that's a floor of a ceiling of the federal government. I would say that it probably would be protective in some way, but it would very much depend on what exactly the federal government was rolling back. But I would say that it would be at least provide a level of protection there.
Thank you. All right, now we're going to move into redistricting. All right. How fair is the IRC process? So why can't you access, oh, I see there's lots of individual questions. So let me just start there. How fair do you think the current process is?
Well, I think the process is significantly more transparent than it has ever been in New York. The commission has gone all over the state and across the various boroughs to get public input. They have a website where you can see the comments that people have made. They are releasing maps publicly on their website, and you can click on their proposed districts and see what the demographic composition is, et cetera. And there are a lot of other tools that are available so people can understand what some of the political consequences are. So I think it is a more transparent process that the IRC is running. I think there's another question of what happens when it comes time for the IRC to vote on plans and whether bipartisanship can be achieved or whether the commission is splintered on party lines. And rather than a unified plan being submitted to the legislature for approval, there is either a number of plans because a number of plans are getting the same number of votes, or there's some other kind of less than ideal set of kind of procedural facts at play. So I think that's really the big question.
Right. And you did reference that they do have a website. Someone's complaining that that they can't access the maps on the IRC website. I also had problem accessing the maps. And then I found some very user-friendly, I guess, citizen sponsored version of the maps online. And so maybe one of my staff can find that reference and put it on chat for everyone, because I agree, my computer wouldn't download their maps.
Yeah, the interface isn't the best.
No. And is there a way for the public to get involved in making sure the maps are drawn fairly when it's at the IRC stage of the process?
Yeah, I think the goal now that proposals have been unveiled is to get public comment on the proposals so they can be adjusted, so votes can be taken. I think it's important to let the commissioners know what you think. So hopefully the public input guides their votes and guides the decision making, and there are plans that are informed by community needs, community desires that are sent over to the legislature.
And someone asked about IRC meetings, and I think that the IRC website, even if their maps are difficult to download, does have information about when and where they are having meetings and how you can watch them. So go check the IRC website. So you did, I think, a very good job of explaining the controversies around the redistricting proposal. Is there some site that also goes into the pros and cons for the redistricting proposal?
I would, I'm not aware of a single site that will have both the pros and the cons. I know different organizations that are involved in redistricting have taken different positions on the ballot proposal. We aren't taking a position. We are just looking to educate the public on the policy details. Folks like the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, and there are a lot of other good government, civic groups, civil rights organizations that are really intimately involved in redistricting and may have more of an advocacy bent.
Okay. Another question. I've heard it said that in the redistricting ballot initiative, the measure removes language from the redistricting rules, will take away the language requiring districts to be compact and contiguous, which makes it even easier for districts to be drawn for political party ends, which they are often under current language. Is this a likely result of approving the changes in the redistricting ballot initiative? Does it somehow give the political parties more flexibility to draw them with their own agendas, draw the districts with their own agendas?
So we are a nonpartisan organization, and we feel strongly about redistricting being fair, both from a race equity standpoint, first and foremost, and from a partisan standpoint as a fairly close second. We never recommend compactness as a criteria. When I do state policy work across the country, it is not an easily definable standard. There are different ways of measuring compactness. It's essentially something that seems like it would constrain the process in some ways, but really it can be gamed. And the other reality, especially when you look at this with a race equity lens, some communities have faced residential segregation, gentrification and displacement, and they may not be concentrated in kind of a neat geography. They may be dispersed geographically in ways that it requires a district that isn't, say, an appealing, clean, square type shape or whatever shape it may be. It may seem a little bit irregular, and there are examples of that. There's a district, kind of an infamous example from the Chicago area. It's often lifted as an example of a gerrymandered district because it looks, it's crescent shaped. It looks like the letter C, but that's where Latino communities live in Chicago. And that's a district that gives Latino communities an ability to elect a preferred candidate. So district shapes and compactness and those sorts of things aren't things that we focus on. We focus on what is the underlying purpose, what are the checks and balances involved, and what are the other criteria, like partisan fairness, like racial fairness.
So this is somebody who is particularly interested in unintended consequences of redistricting. Even though you're a nonpartisan and you're not giving your judgment on the redistricting proposal, does anything stand out to you about how there would be new and unintended consequences from the proposed version versus what we have?
Not in my read, because the commission is still advisory. The reality is that the political, the redistricting still has to navigate the political process through the legislature. And so the changes that, I don't want to minimize the changes that are happening. It is going to be a different system in terms of the distribution of votes that advances a map from the commission to the legislature. But that second phase, the legislative phase, and again, there are some tweaks in terms of what that looks like, but that's still common. Some of the other changes, like fixing the number of state Senate seats, that's been a tool that has been actually used as part of partisan gamesmanship, with the size of the Senate increasing to provide for additional opportunities in recent decades for Republicans to draw additional Republican state Senate districts. So, fixing the number of districts is pretty standard. Most states have fixed the sizes of their two chambers and don't allow that to be used to give one party or the other an advantage. And I think I wouldn't minimize the importance of removing that really unfortunate language from the New York Constitution that would exclude non-citizens and Native people from counting. We should really be striving to clean up our state laws of these legacies of discrimination and xenophobia, that's an important thing.
And for the record, the fact that we were for so many decades counting prisoners in the prisons where they sat, even though they couldn't vote, rather than the district that they lived in before and were assumed to be returning to, translated into the prisons being built as far away as possible from New York City in districts that were depending on greater amounts of money to flow to them because they had increased their population through prisoners, and incentivized putting people in prison and keeping them there. So really need to think through I would argue, well, that was a very intended consequence, not unintended. I don't think the vast majority of New Yorkers ever really understood the ramifications of allowing prisoners to be counted in a certain way that translated into increased criminal penalties, more jail time, the building of more prisons in specific districts far, far away from where prisoners actually lived. And there are consequences for that in criminal justice, because research shows that if you cut off people from their families for long periods of time because they are so far away, families can't come and visit, you actually increase the problems of attempting to successfully reintegrate people back into the community when their time's up. So that one always is, I think, a particularly important example to highlight, that there are real ramifications for these kinds of things that most people would go, I don't even know what we're talking about with that. So thank you about that. So the next questioner is pointing out that there might be slight improvements in the redistricting, but they're still not sure because it's flawed for other reasons. So what is your opinion of voting for a marginal improvement or voting against it if you're not getting everything you want with this proposal?
What I can say is redistricting reform is one of the hardest areas of the law to change, especially in states where where the citizen initiative process is unavailable, like New York, and reform necessarily has to move through the political process. And of course, lawmakers are thinking about redistricting, not just as a policy that affects everyone in a state, but also their jobs. And so, I have learned that the good is not the enemy of the perfect, and steps forward are steps forward. So that's come from years of working to get improvements here and there, and really finding it very difficult, even in places where you would think that lawmakers are progressively minded and interested in fairness. But so I think anything that makes redistricting more transparent, easier for the public to understand what's happening, and easier for the public to engage is worth considering seriously.
Okay, so again, I'm just reading someone else's question. This is not my judgment call. Quote, while I favor nonpartisan redistricting on a nationwide basis, I do not want to require it in my state if doing so will give a national edge to anti-democratic forces in other states that have no scruples about partisan gerrymandering. Is the redistricting initiative open to this objection, that it will somehow advantage other states' agendas instead of just being for us and our decisions?
I understand the concern, and I would frame it as unilateral disarmament, where certain folks feel that places like California and other states that are more democratic, that are more progressive, are changing their laws to make them more fair. And so other states that aren't as open to these ideas, places like Texas and North Carolina, will continue to gerrymander to give the Republicans that control the process an undue advantage. The one thing that I would say in response is when you look at independent redistricting, commission-based redistricting, which took place in California and other places, Democrats do fine when the process is fair. In fact, for California, switching from a legislative redistricting process to an independent redistricting process arguably created more competitive seats, where as politics evolved in the state throughout over the course of the last decade, new seats became competitive. Places in Orange County, places that really were formerly Republican strongholds. And so I don't think there's any reason to fear a fair process. Though I do understand where the concern comes from. I just don't think there's really a lot of evidence to back that up.
We'll give you one more redistricting before we shift topic. What is the impact of proposed federal redistricting legislation on what we do here in New York State with our redistricting law?
So there's two big democracy bills that are currently pending in Congress. One is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would restore a lot of the protections that the Supreme Court struck down, Voting Rights Act protections, that is. And that bill could have consequences for New York if New York was covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. It would mean that the state would have to submit its redistricting plans to the Department of Justice or to a federal court to see if they were fair to racial, ethnic, and language minority groups. But that, again, that's nothing to fear. So that would have consequences for New York. The other big democracy bill is the Freedom to Vote Act. And that would create a set of standards that would apply to all states that are drawing congressional districts. It would ban partisan gerrymandering, require race equity and fairness. I don't think that change would be too material given the criteria that currently exist in New York. But if the process went off the rails for whatever reason, and the state was gerrymandered, it would mean that gerrymander could be challenged in federal court.
Thank you. Okay, I think we jumped to Yuri with the next couple of questions. So California voters receive mail-in ballots without having to call for one. Do we think New York should have the same system? And would the initiative on the ballot this year allow for such?
Sure. So having a universal mail-in voting system like California currently is impossible in New York because of the constitutional limits on no excuse absentee voting. So if voters were to approve Proposal 4 in November, a universal mail-in voting system like what's in California and I believe it's 5 or 6 other states may be something that New York can consider adopting sometime in the future.
So it would give the legislature the flexibility to actually pass those kinds of laws, because
Right.
we would have the opening in our constitution to do so, right?
Right, absolutely.
Okay. So are any of us who are interested in voting by mail expansion going to address workarounds for the new announcements by the U.S. Postal Service that they are slowing down mail delivery? I don't know if that's a constitutional question, but I think all of us who depend on the mail for things are very aware of the slowdowns that already are existing in U.S. mail. Is that part of the conversation that you're hearing from around the country or other places that depend more on mailed ballots?
Sure. So, certainly when people are looking at expanding access to mail voting or absentee voting, they take into account what's happening with the post office. But currently in New York, under current law, if you turn in your ballot by election day, it'll be counted as long as it's received within a week of the election. You're also allowed to drop your absentee ballot off at your polling location, and you're actually allowed to skip the line if you're just dropping your ballot off, which is actually something I wasn't aware of until fairly recently. And in terms of other workarounds in New York for postal delays, I'm aware of at least one bill that passed the state Senate earlier this year that would allow for the use of absentee ballot drop-off locations.
Correct, we did allow that. Do any of us know, and it might be my own staff, and then they'll put it in chat, is the Board of Elections or New York City Votes going to be mailing out any piece of information to voters that explains these ballot proposals, since so many people are not on social media? And I think the questioner is highlighting the real digital divide in many communities between people who have computer access and people who don't. So I don't know the answer to that question. Does anyone else? If not, we'll leave it to staff to put something on chat.
I do think that the New York City's voter guide, which I think is the same, is doing one and is being released this week. I don't know if it's available other than online, but I think traditionally that is a publication that goes out. Don't quote me on that.
I think you're right, but I also wasn't sure. So, right. So we'll see if somebody types into chat that they actually know. Now I'm going to switch to the questions that are actually coming in on chat. Just give me a second to sort of read that. Sorry. Lots of interesting materials to go and look up and read and study after we're done tonight. I think that the question about changing the 63 senators was answered. So I know I started in the Senate in the year 2002, and I was one of 61 senators. Then we went to 62 senators 10 years later. Then we went to 63 senators. And the assembly is not allowed to change their number at all. And it gets to be sort of obvious what's going on. So I personally think pretty good idea to pick a number and stick with it. How does, we already covered that one with fracking. All right, this person clearly doesn't live in my district because they're asking about well water, Kate. And I really urge everyone who lives in my district, do not attempt to drill down into Manhattan to look for your fresh water. but I guess they have a house somewhere else as well. So if they have well water and it becomes polluted, who would pay for the remediation or installation of piped water? I guess the question is whether or not we constitutionally establish the right to clean air and clean water. So do you know what happens now?
Yeah.
Any reason to think it would change?
So it's kind of a complicated question. So currently, well water is not under a regulatory framework for testing contaminants, just the way public water supplies are. That's definitely a gap in New Yorkers who access water. New Yorkers who access water through well water don't have the same protections of a public water supply testing. In terms of like who is the responsible party for cleaning up your contaminated water. Certainly if it's private, you would have under existing environmental laws for contamination, probably causes of action against a polluter if you could identify one. There may be state programs that assist. I actually don't know the exact answer if there's like a state program that would assist someone in cleaning up a contaminated site. I mean, things like, Hoosick Falls, which was actually, it's a very small community up in upstate New York. And a lot of this environmental rights work came out of a contamination event they had there. It was actually a loophole that was fixed in the law recently that actually municipal water supplies that supply under a certain number of people didn't have the same testing requirements. So contamination of PFAS chemicals occurred in Hoosick Falls. That municipality was not required to test for that. I don't know if there probably are individuals impacted by private wells in that scenario, but there's obviously, it's a big process to get those sites remediated and access to clean water, and through a very complicated process of finding the party that polluted the water, which was a facility, I think, that made Teflon up there. So it's not the perfect answer, but it is definitely a gap for individuals who have private wells.
Thank you. So going back to redistricting, which I knew would have the most questions because it is the most complex to understand. So thank you, Yurij, for being our expert here. Can you explain a little more clearly what the border splitting issue is, and some examples perhaps of what that means?
So the rules for the state Senate map, this block on border rule required districts not to cross town boundaries. But that rule did not exist for other types of municipalities like cities and other relevant kind of geographic units that are below the state and county level. That rule, again, has traditionally been used to bake in an advantage for the Republican Party. And so its removal just gets rid of a criteria that has partisan consequences, quite frankly. So I think that really is the upshot of that rule. It's not being replaced with anything new. It's just removing something that I think if you look at it, does build in an advantage for one party.
And also, if you ever want to sort of look at all of the different municipal boundary definitions in New York State, it's fairly fascinating because we're all in New York City, so we just fight over, which borough we're in and who's hipper. But in the rest of the state, you can be in a village, within a township, within a municipal something or other, within a city. Nassau County has more districts than most of the rest of the country all totaled together. You can have cities of 300 and villages of 4,000 that are all incorporated together. So it's really sort of funky out there when you're trying to redistrict and trying to, fit into certain rules that were clearly designed for one party or the other over history. But it also opens up, all kinds of other questions about who came up with these ideas for how we defined our municipalities, because a lot of it's very strange. But going back to a question, and I think the questioner might be confusing a couple of things, but that's okay. So this person is 100% in favor of extending the vote to all residents, regardless of their citizenship status, which is not a question on the ballot this year. This question is definitional. Should a vote not be what distinguishes the citizen from the non-citizen? So again, this question is not on the ballot. It's not being brought to our Constitution. I think the questioner perhaps misunderstood as you were explaining that the counts for how many people live in any geographic area should include non-citizens as well as citizens. Did I get that one right, Yurij?
That's exactly right. Essentially, not for purposes of voting, but for purposes of being represented, for purposes of being a constituent. The principle is that everyone counts. Kids count. Those under 18, they can't vote. They count. Non-citizens can't vote. They should count. That wasn't always the case, and a holdover from, fortunately, a bygone era was this explicit state constitutional command to exclude immigrants, to exclude non-citizens. And so that's what would be getting rid of. That part of the Constitution is unlawful because of some Supreme Court cases in the 1960s. But still, it's just removing those ugly legacies. I think it's a good idea.
I do too. And by the way, it's also relevant. Remember how like a year and a half ago, we were all running around like crazy people? We need everyone to fill out their census reports. We need every person in New York City to fill out the census. Didn't matter whether you were a citizen or not. Why were we so desperate for that? Because our population, regardless of citizenship, drives how much federal money comes to us compared to splitting it up into other jurisdictions. So if New York is behind where we should be in actually counting people, it messes with federal money coming to us. And that's also true for district purposes, because the state does in fact distribute any number of different funding streams based on population per district. So if we're not getting correct counts of everybody who actually lives in a district, we're messing with the funding of New York's education funds, just as a primary example, that if we're not counting immigrants' kids in our school counts when we know they're here and going to school, we're really cutting off our nose to spite our face, I think is the expression used. So thank you. Okay, question again regarding redistricting. If these changes had been implemented last time redistricting was done, would we have had a different and better result? Is there anybody who can do this kind of analysis?
I think it's hard to say, but I think it's hard to compare. We don't know exactly how this process will unfold. I think it would be better in that the current process with an advisory commission is far more transparent. It's much less kind of brokered deals in back rooms, which, from my understanding, was how things played out in New York last time. A deal couldn't even be reached on the congressional map. A court had to step in to draw the congressional districts because the split legislature and the governor couldn't agree. So those are all positive developments, and hopefully having the IRC in the mix this time around will produce maps, because it's never good when the process fails because of deadlock. And certainly gerrymandering was a problem in New York. If you take a look at the way that the state Senate map was drawn, and you look at how districts were sized, New York City in particular, districts were drawn to be as big as possible, as populous as possible. Districts upstate were drawn to be less populated. And when you look at the census results and you see that the population in and around New York City is growing while the populations upstate are shrinking, that sort of manipulation of the redistricting rules to shore up support for a certain party, that experience is very real. And so, I do think that by shedding light on how things play out, and giving the public a greater voice, we should see some improvement, at the very least, greater public awareness as things are happening in terms of what the consequences are.
Great. Okay, so this just in, an attendee reports he has received his voter guide in the mail today. So everybody check their mailboxes. They should be getting them soon. To answer a question earlier. So I was doing a shout out, did anyone know? And thank you whoever shared that they are arriving, because his arrived in the mail. Okay. Again, additional question about redistricting. Concerned that there's a shortened timeline between the first and second independent redistricting timeframes. Should we be concerned, and why is it such a short time frame?
Yeah, I don't know that fact is particularly concerning, as long as there is clear dialogue between the legislature and it's communicated to the commission what about the initial submission was caused the legislature to vote it down or not to be able to carry the votes. 2 weeks is enough time to make adjustments. I think because at that stage, it is beyond the really public input. At that point, it's trying to find how can redistricting be done in a way that it can pass through the legislature and get the governor's signature, which is the reality of the New York process. I do think 2 weeks is probably sufficient time to figure that piece out. It's probably not sufficient time if it's if what the need is to get the public to weigh in on things, but that's it. That's a different phase of the process that is more political.
I think computer analysis has made it so much easier to deal with developing maps and alternatives, and there's even programs now you can go online and you can design your own districts based on the data that's available. So, you can be your own individual redistricting commission, just for comparison, if you're interested in that. The last question, because we're pretty much out of time, and I knew we would get this, and I could have written this question. The redistricting question is too complex for the average voter. What's the expectation with this ballot? Does anybody have any polling data showing whether the public are for or against this? I am not aware of any polling data that is available. Anybody else?
I haven't seen any polling or heard of it, and because we're not taking an advocacy position on it, we haven't been as engaged on trying, one way or another, and so we've just been doing public education.
Oh. So we really have run out of time. So I want to thank our tremendous presenters, Patrick Berry, Yurij Rudensky, and Kate Kurera, for being with us tonight and helping us sort through these 5 questions. You still have time to continue homework. It's not election day right away. Our next event will be our actual 3-day in a row senior resource fair sessions. We're not doing live senior resource fairs, so we've attempted to move them into a virtual model again this year, as we did last year, where we will share resources to nourish the body, the soul, and the mind. Our first is Tuesday, October 19th, hosting exercise, nutrition, and meditation. Our second, Wednesday, October 20th, where we share resources for your pets. That's a new one this year. And then our third Thursday, October 21st, we hold our final session on arts, continuing education, and technology. All 3 sessions are from 2 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. And we don't check your ID or your age when you log on. So feel free if you're interested in defining yourself as a senior. Thank you for coming tonight. Remember, continue to wash your hands, avoid large indoor and outdoor gatherings, wear a mask in public indoor settings, even if you are vaccinated. And it's important to get tested for COVID if you develop any symptoms or exposed to someone with the coronavirus, even if you are vaccinated and even if you are feeling fine. It helps everyone when people are tested. And if you know anyone left who hasn't been vaccinated, do your damnedest to get them to do so. So again, thank you all. Thank you, my wonderful staff who puts these together, and have a good night.